But before we start, a very nice quotation from Mark Twain. He says, India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the great grandmother of tradition. Mark Twain, the famous author. One request, please keep yourselves muted. I will from time to time stop my talk and ask you to pose any questions. But until I do that, please keep noting if you have a question, but please keep yourself muted. Okay, that's a request. So we already saw on Wednesday that what we call Veda, or the eternal Apaurushaya knowledge, which appeared in the minds of the sages, the rishis, about whom you all read, during deep meditation in a spiritual state, where these knowledge, ideas, intellectual, spiritual thoughts, thoughts is perhaps not the right word, knowledge is a better word, simply appeared in their mind, which they recorded and then transmitted orally to their students. Their students further transmitted it to their students, and that Guru Shishya Parampara from the Rishi all the way to our own time has come down. In the historical process, some of that, of course, was lost, but there were a lot of techniques that the intellectuals of our tradition invented to preserve that knowledge. That included several things that we will see. But the Veda, we also saw, included basically two parts. One is called Sanghita. Sanghita is a systematic collection of the mantras. Mantras are the seeds of that knowledge. That is, the collection of that is Samhita. Then we saw three other parts, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishada. We have seen this last time. But to assist the preservation and actual practical aspect of the Veda, there is also another two sets of literature called Vedanga, or the bodies or limbs of Veda, and Upaveda. So these are supplemental and supporting and augmenting parts of the Vedic literature itself. We have seen all this. So the Vedanga, or the supplemental Vedic text. Okay, what I'm going to do, because you are not listening to me, I'm going to mute all of you. Why can you not mute yourself, please? It just wastes everybody's time, right? You have question, you can wait, Pratyusha. I said I will give you time, but this distracts. 1 second, let me just mute all of you. I don't want to do it, but you don't leave me with a choice. Okay, all of you are muted except let's say Amrita. Amrita, you can unmute yourself. This is so that you let me know if you can't hear me or can't see my screen, etc. But everybody else will remain muted and cannot mute themselves.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So there are 6 Vedangas, or limbs of Veda, as I was saying. These 6 really support and supplement the mantra, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishada. What are those 6? Every Hindu should know this much, that those 6 Vedangas are known as, first is Shiksha. Shiksha is the phonetics, and we shall spend like a couple of minutes. I will go into the detail, but it's how to pronounce the sounds in the correct way, because it's extremely important for the Vedic mantras to be pronounced in a certain way. So Shiksha is the first Vedanga. Chanda or the prosody, as it is known as in English language. Chanda is the meters used in the Veda, especially the Rig Veda. So these meters are, even today we use meters in writing a poem, right? In writing a rhyme or a poem. The meters of Veda and their signs is called Chanda. Nirukta is the etymology and interpretation of the Veda. So as I said, if you remember, as I said on Wednesday, the language used in the Vedic Bhasha mantras, it is not very easy to straight away interpret the meaning of those mantras. Because to start with, that language is older form of Sanskrit. It is actually known as Chandas Bhasha. So Chandas Bhasha is different from Sanskrit. Quite honestly, it's not very straightforward for even a learned Sanskrit Pandit to truly know the meaning of what is said by the mantra. So Nirukta is a tool which is used to interpret the Vedas. So Nirukta is how each word is derived, what are the different meanings, and some context of when to use which meaning. That science is called Nirukta. Vyakarana is the grammar, which we all know what grammar means. So grammar of that older Sanskrit Bhasha is called a Vyakarana, and it's one of the Vedangas. Jyotisha is astronomy / astrology. So Vedanga Jyotisha is extremely required for Veda, because Vedic rituals are performed according to specific time of the day, specific day of the month, and on certain specific configurations of the planets and astral bodies. So therefore, a science of being able to identify, calculate, determine all of that, science of the sky and time, that science is called Jyotisha. Jyotisha is one of the Vedangas. Kalpa is very important again. Kalpa is the set of texts and that knowledge which helps, number one, do the rituals in the right way. There are several parts. I'll come to Kalpa in some detail, but Kalpa at a high level is that knowledge, that set of books or texts which help the Vedika people perform the rituals and their day-to-day life in a certain code, certain way. Okay, so that's called Kalpa. It includes seeds of mathematics and geometry, by the way. That's a very important. The trigonometry and very complex geometry is part of that Kalpa, some of the sutras which are used in Kalpa. So, as I said, we will spend maybe a couple of minutes each to each of these six. So first is Vedika phonetics or Shiksha, first of the six Vedangas. So unlike English language, where you have letters like A, B, C, D, etc., where these are simply 26 letters thrown at random, there is no order or systematic sequence. After all, why A first, why not B first? We do not know. It is simply like this, and the whole word follows it, A, B, C, D, E up to Z. Same thing for even the Arabic or Persian languages, or most of the other languages, except Indian language. All the Indian languages, of course, are derived from and influenced by and nourished by Sanskrit Bhasha. Indic languages follow a very scientific method to the phonetics, the sounds we speak. So first of all, I don't know if all of you are familiar with at least one Indian language. I hope most of you know your mother tongue, and akshar gyan you may have of that language. Those of you who don't, just have patience. I'm sure you will understand what I'm saying. But those of you who know either Devanagari or Hindi Bhasha or Telugu or any other Indian language will understand it immediately. So or Varnamala or the collection of letters in any Indian language is the swara first, a, I, u, etc. first, and then what we call vyanjanas or the uh, um, consonants later, ka, kha, ga, gha. Within that, ka, kha, ga, gha, cha, cha, ja, jha, etc., there are 5 classes or varga, as it is known as in Sanskrit Bhasha. These 5, ka, kha, ga, gha is the first group, cha, cha, ja, jha is the second group. You can clearly notice that these are ordered in a certain sequence, and that sequence is according to the place in your mouth, in your vocal system, right from the back of the tongue or just top of the throat, starting from there, which is known as kantha. From there, if you say ka, kha, you will notice that the muscles of that region in your mouth is where the articulation or the motion comes from. Ka. So all the sounds of the language which come from there, from the kantha, are put together in as a group. Once those 5 ka to nga is collected, then there is next one cha, cha, ja, jha, which is the articulation. If you say it cha, cha, ja, etc., you can clearly see that they come from a region in the mouth, just at the top of the base of your tongue, you can say, which is known as talavya in Sanskrit Bhasha, talavya. Similarly, there is murdhanya, next set of letters which are ta, tha, dha. You can see that the tongue is striking at the top of your mouth, which is known as murdhanya. That place in the mouth is called murdhanya or murdhani. So murdhani, the place where this sound comes from, these letters are called murdhanya. Similarly, dantya, the tongue, tip of the tongue touches top of the teeth. So when you say ta, tha, try to say it, ta, tha, da, you will notice that this sound comes when the tongue touches the teeth, not otherwise. Yes, somebody who doesn't have a teeth, maybe in old age, you might notice the sound of ta, tha, dha is little different. Yeah, and then oshtha. Oshtha is the letters or the sounds which come by moving the lips. Pa, pa, you see, pa, pa, ba, bha. All of these you are able to say when lips make a effort. So these sounds are called oshtha. Anyway, I'm just trying to give you a glimpse that there's this is actually just ABCD of this Vedanga. There is huge science further after this, where the amount of and the time of each articulation, how much breathing is involved in each sound, then tones behind the sounds, all of these is part of this Vedanga, which each student of the Veda has to first learn. So in fact, this is the starting of the education. When a child in the ancient India used to go to the school, then the first thing they used to learn is shiksha, or this science of phonetics, which is why it is known as shiksha. It is where the shiksha starts, education starts. Okay. I will not yet stop for question. I will take 10 more minutes, cover a couple of other things, and then stop. So I mentioned Nirukta as the next Vedanga. And I already said that Nirukta is about interpreting the meaning of what the Vedic mantras mean. Yes. Now, there are, for every Vedic mantra, to really be able to understand what it means, it's not easy at all. Somebody last time on Wednesday was asking, can I go ahead and read English translation? You will be surprised if you read the English translation. Most of the English translations especially done by the Western scholars, they of course are very interested in learning Veda, and there are several translations available done in last 200 years. But if you read those translations, you would be um, ending up being more confused, let me put it that way, than clear about what Veda says. You perhaps, if you are not sympathetic to the rishis, you might even say what they are talking about. They're confused people. They don't even know what is valuable and what is useless. That's the kind of confusion you will end up with. Reason being, they do not know the science of nirukta. There are layers of meaning in the Veda. Veda is not just child's rhymes. Veda is full of layers of meaning. There are three layers of meaning in general. First is called adhibhautika, which is the physical meaning, surface meaning of what it says. Okay, so anything that Veda says, there is, of course, there is a surface meaning, most basic meaning. But even to understand the most basic surface physical meaning, we need to really know nirukta. Okay, so for example, Saraswati, this word occurs, as I said last time. There are several rivers named, more than a dozen rivers are named in Rig Veda Samhita. The word Saraswati, the literal meaning, the adhibhautik meaning of Saraswati is going to be simply the river Saraswati. Okay, but then that's not the end of it. There is the next layer of meaning in the mantras, which are called adhidaivika, which is related to the deities. Each mantra itself is a sound body of a deity. You should know this, which is why we say that if you are not in a clean state, if you are not taken bath, if you are not in a prepared way, you should not be hearing or forget about reciting a mantra. This, I'm sure some of you, most of you may have heard it from your parents or grandparents, that Gayatri mantra, don't utter it loudly. Say it silently and only when you have taken bath, things like those. Why? Because mantra is the very body, ethereal body, sound body of the Devata. Mantra are Devata. I told you last time also. Veda, literal meaning of Brahma is Veda. Veda is Brahma. So each of these mantras are sound bodies of Devata, and this Adhidaivika meaning of that mantra is talking about that deity, because mantra is deity. Okay, so Nirukta helps in understanding deity layer of that mantra. And lastly, and most complex meaning of the mantra is Adhyatmika, or the spiritual meaning. So there are so many raids, for example, talked about. Rishis, what do they have to do with raids? Raids on cows, for example. Several mantras in Rig Veda talk about horses running, for example. So because the Western people don't go into the layers of meaning, they simply translate that as rishis representing a society which was pretty primitive, where they were looting the cows of each other, or taming domesticating the horses. Therefore, they were tribal primitive people. That's the conclusion they reach. Reason being, they have not really gotten into the true meanings of the mantra. I gave the example of Saraswati. So of course, basic meaning, adhibhautik meaning of Saraswati is the river. Saraswati, if you go further detailed, it means one that flows, okay, with flow. So we can definitely get that much meaning, that Saraswati river was a very important river for Rigvedic sages, and Saraswati river was flowing with a lot of water. That much we can derive out of the Saraswati Adhibhautika meaning. Then Daivika meaning is all about the Saraswati, the goddess, the deity Saraswati. And then again, we have to be careful. Some mantras talk about Saraswati, some other mantras talk about, for example, Bharati. Now Bharati, this also generally we take for same as Saraswati, but in Rigveda, if they say some word, it has some deeper meaning at the Daivika stara or level. So Bharati is slightly different in context than Saraswati. Okay, so that's just example. Lastly, Adhyatmika. Now Saraswati represents a certain force in our existence. Saraswati, beyond a Devi and a river, Saraswati is also that inspiration in our intellect which inspires us to do something, to learn something, which gives us speech, that psychological spiritual power within us, which makes us articulate. All of that power and force in the spiritual sense is also called Saraswati. So therefore, there are various ways, and this Nirukta helps us understand the meaning. Any questions so far? I will unmute. I will unmute you and you can ask questions. Okay, those who have questions can unmute and ask, but
So,
be brief. Be brief.
did our ancestors know about the structure of the mouth? Like, does that prove it?
Yeah.
Answer is yes, of course. Not only that, um, our ancestors went to the extent of explaining how exactly do we hear and see things. So there is a very detailed psychological description of when somebody speaks, then how is the other person hearing it. They say, they even say that, okay, your mouth made those sounds created vibrations in the ether. Okay, so they talk about tattvas. I will not get into those details, but they talk about tattvas, and they talk about sensory um, reception of the tattvas. So mouth, karmendriya is the name given to each of the action organs of the body. 5 action organs are there and 5 knowledge organs are there. So when we speak, our mouth made certain vibrations in the ether or air that traveled up to the ear of the listener. Then there is a diaphragm, and it's all written it's not very recent also, it's a very ancient text. It's called Sphot theory. So Sphot happens. So then this vibration reaches the diaphragm of the ear. Once the diaphragm receives that vibration, it sends a signal to the mind. The mind then applies, mind is another indriya, Jnanendriya, beyond Jnanendriya, then there is a mana or mind. Mind receives that signal, etc., does a processing, then there is a cognition or um, prama that happens. And that cognition of this signal then results in us knowing what the other person said. So absolutely, our ancestors not only just knew the structure of the mouth, they knew this entire they were the first to articulate how we make sound, how we receive sound. And same way sight, same way taste, same way touch, heat, etc. Any other question?
Yes,
So-
I have a
Go ahead.
They knew about sound waves back then?
Yes, yes, that's what I explained.
We're still discussing it. They already knew it?
I already said yes, they knew it, yes. So not only
Okay.
knew it, they did a lot more than knowing it. They explained it, and they utilized that science to create the chanting. There are so many applications of it. In interest of time, I will not get into the details. But sound has a whole science behind it. It's called Nada Vijnana. So by applying the right kind of sounds, which is exactly Veda chanting is about, there are certain effects created. If we do that properly as per the procedure, then we can actual results of such as causing the rain, such as natural phenomena around us, we can see that happening. That's called nad.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
I
I
have a
will
question.
proceed. Okay, go
I
ahead.
have a question.
One
Like
question only.
Okay,
One
okay,
question.
okay.
What does bhautika mean?
Bhautika means physical, related to bhuta. There are 5 bhutas, mahabhutas,
Yeah.
which are elements such as earth, water, etc. So
Yeah.
5 bhutas means physical. Bhautika means physical.
Okay.
What else?
That's
I have a
all.
question.
Okay, let's proceed.
Can you like ask me to unmute again? Because I'm
Please,
muted.
please, please, please mute yourself. I don't want to waste time in muting and muting everybody. So just follow discipline. Once you are done speaking, mute yourself. I don't want background conversations to disturb other people. Thank you. So let's start, continue. Next is prosody or the chanda. Okay. Again, it's a great intellectual, I would say, revolution that the ancestors identified, the rishis, they identified that the sound patterns are also there. Forget about the meaning. The patterns in the sound, if repeated, cause a certain psychological impact to us. That was a great discovery. And you will see that this chanda, first of all, understand what chanda means. So I'm sure all of you have done rhymes. Yeah, all of you know definitely some song or some poem or the other. And when you sing a song, when you sing a poem, uh, as the line ends, or in between the line where the certain part of the line ends, there is a pattern, and it is that pattern in the sound that causes some happiness or some emotional reaction in the mind. Yes, for example, rhyming poem. So in the end, when the rhyme comes, right, similar sound comes. That similar sound makes that whole set of words really pleasurable to read. Sometimes pleasurable, but sometimes there are tragic songs. Then the tragedy, emotion of tragedy in the song, it is elevated because there is certain pattern in the sound. Now that discovery is not a small discovery, and we should all be really proud to know that for the first time, at least in the recorded history, this recognition of pattern of sounds called meters was in India as well. Okay, and that's called chanda. So there are 7 such patterns or meters or chanda which are used in the Vedas, especially Rig Veda. So all of us have heard the name Gayatri Chanda. Yes. So Gayatri is actually not just one mantra, but name of a chanda which is repeated several times. Second most frequently repeated chanda in the Rig Veda is called Gayatri Chanda. In Gita, Krishna says that of all the chanda, I am the Gayatri Chanda. Krishna says in Gita. So if you notice, all of you, I hope, know the Gayatri mantra. Don't say it aloud. Just in your mind, just count the letters, not the letters, but the syllables. So the first one, you can start counting how many syllables are there in that first line. So this is 1. This is 2. This is 3. This is 4 together. This is 4, 1 syllable. This is 5. Yeah. So total 8. Okay. So total 8 syllables in the first line. Again, if you will count, you will reach 8. Again, if you count, you will reach 8. So 8 letters, and there are more patterns, not just letters, but other patterns. 8 syllables, I shouldn't say letters. 8 syllables in each line and 3 such lines. Total 24 syllables. That type of meter is called Gayatri Chanda, and that's the smallest chanda and second most popular chanda, as I said. Similarly, there are 6 other, and these chandas themselves are in Hindu belief considered the 7 horses of the sun. Sun deity, as we see sun deity in the morning, the imagination in the minds of creative sages is that sun deity is arriving in a chariot driven by 7 horses, and these 7 chandas are those horses. But again, don't take it literally. So you can't have literal meaning of it. It is a deeper, layered meaning, what it really means. So that's chanda. Grammar is another, I think, if you ask me, top 3 intellectual achievements of humans. I'm not saying Indians, humans. Top 3 achievements of humans intellectually. One of those 3 is going to be grammar. Without grammar, you cannot contain, sustain any knowledge. And I'm sure all of you know what grammar means. Grammar is the science of language. It means the proper way of speaking. So we saw earlier the proper way of making sounds. Then we saw proper way of lyrical arrangement of sounds or patterns, meanings. But the proper way of making a sentence, which is meaningful, which has precise meaning, which has not ambiguity in it, that science is called grammar. In Sanskrita Bhasha, we call it Vyakarana. So Vyakarana Vidya, again, India is the pioneer. Nobody even comes second, third or fourth in creation of grammar. So we have this great sage named Panini. Panini was about 600 years BCE, which is 2,700 years before our time. And Panini created the first available grammar, okay, of Sanskrit Bhasha. And it's a marvel in itself. This grammar has 4,000 very small formulae using which the entire Sanskrit Bhasha is described. If you know the formulae of Panini, then you know the entire Sanskrit Bhasha. Yeah, and those formulae. So as you know, Sanskrit is perhaps the richest, not perhaps, it is the richest Bhasha in terms of the science of word creation. Each word in Sanskrit, you don't have to refer to dictionary. If you know certain root words, about 2,000 root words, that's all. Then you can know millions of other words. As long as you know 2,000 root words, you can know the entire universe of Sanskrit literature. Okay, and just to give you an idea of the science behind Panini's grammar, why it is a marvel. The formulae themselves use what would not be available until 2,000 years more, as what we know as combinatorics, which is making the combinations. Okay, those of you who are in high school know perhaps this NCR and NPR, combinations and permutations. So Panini utilized the science of combinations and permutations 2,700 years back. He created, for example, if you, I don't know if you can read on the left hand side, the first 14 sentences in his book called Ashtadhyayi have those combinations given, which goes like ayun, rilik, ayong, ayo, chayavarat, etc., where each line simply says starting from this letter to this letter is one group, from this letter to this letter another group, and then rest of the 4,000 or so formulae, he simply refers to the groups. So that kind of combinatorics makes it so economical for him to really compile a very terse and concise grammar of Sanskrit Bhasha. So again, he was not the first. He refers himself that there used to be earlier grammarians before Panini. Unfortunately, we have lost those older grammars, but we know the names. So there are so many, at least about 7 or 8 names which are available of grammarians who happened before Panini. Okay. Astrology, you should know that in our textbooks, they tell us so many things about how Greeks were the first to discover the radius of the earth, etc., etc. They do not tell you enough of how much is accurate and precise and detailed information about astronomy available in the Vedic literature. For example, it is a surprise to know that speed of light. Can you imagine speed of light, which humans in the West, in the modern times, did not know until less than 100 years back? But speed of light is very precisely mentioned in the Rig Veda and mentioned in a commentary on that by Sayanacharya in 1300s. So speed of light is mentioned. Similarly, while rest of the world, especially Quran, Bible, etc., kept saying, they still say Quran and Bible, which is the sacred books of Christians and Muslims, they still say that Earth does not revolve around the sun. It is the sun that rotates. And in the Vedic literature, we very clearly find heliocentric planetary system in Yajurveda more than once, and in later Vedic literature several places. It is very clearly mentioned that sun is the center of this planetary system. Every planet revolves around them. And then the right, I don't know if you noticed, when you go to a temple, in almost every Hindu temple, there would be Navagraha in the corner of the temple. And we offer either oil or water or some other, auspicious objects out of devotion to Navagraha, and take a, we rotate around them, yes. The configuration, if you notice, of Navagraha, which is going on for centuries, it quite amazingly accurate to the modern knowledge we have of the planets. So some of the dwarf planets, which have been expelled out of the counting of planets, actually were not counted in our Vedic literature. So the dwarf planets, which Pluto, etc., which have been now considered non-planets or dwarf planets, those were never counted in the first place. Okay, very accurate knowledge, heliocentric model. Then Veda mentions moon very clearly as a satellite of Earth. Again, far advanced of its time, when Chinese and Egyptian civilizations were, of course, monitoring, and they also were making observation. They also did some striking things which we cannot perhaps fathom. But Vedas were far ahead of any of those. Veda, for example, talked about the gravity. So in one of the commentaries of Shankaracharya, we clearly see the identity of principle of gravity. Okay, number 108, for example, all Hindus have a special place for this number 108. In Vedic literature, this number is used at so many places for so many things. In the daily ritual, every Hindu that does japa, we do japa for either 108 times or 1080 times, which is 10 times 108. Okay, so there is a significant meaning of this number, which is that it's a ratio of the distance between sun and earth with the diameter of the sun. Okay, so that ratio is 108, and surprisingly, it's the same ratio for the same calculation between the comparison of moon size and earth size and their distance as well. Okay, so that number is 108. Eclipses, while in the Western world, in the Muslim world, for example, up to the year 1000 or 1100, they did not know the science or actual explanation behind the lunar solar eclipse, etc. In the Vedic literature, in the Vedanga Jyotisha, we have very clear explanation of the eclipses. Aryabhatta in the 5th century writes an entire very precise model of why the eclipses happen, solar and lunar eclipses. But that's an explanation. The Vedic people, of course, already knew about how it happens. Okay, so all of that is to give you an idea of what Jyotisha means. Then comes Kalpa, last one. Kalpa has 4 aspects actually. So there is, I already mentioned Panini's grammar, which is written in a sutra form or formulae. Very terse, very small sentences which describe the whole science. Because if they start writing lengthy sentences and whole paragraphs, it will fill multiple volumes, many books, which they don't want to do. They want to be very economical with the words. And therefore, they use something called sutras. Sutra is that terse, small, short, brief, precise, concise formula. Okay. So Kalpa is set of 4 bodies of those formulas. First is Grahya Sutra. Grahya Sutra is the prescription to the householders like ourselves to do certain duties and rituals in their daily life, from the birth of child to how the different what we call sanskaras that will happen all the way till the death. What are some of the duties from the ritual perspective to be done by householders? Those are called Grahya Sutras. Then there are Shrauta Sutras, which are used by priests for performing the yajnas, such as Rajasuya Yajna or Ashwamedha Yajna, etc. I'm sure you have heard those names. So large scale public Agnihotras or Yajnas, when those prayogas are done, how to do those? That body of literature in sutra form again is called Shrauta Sutras. So there are multiple Grahya and Shrauta Sutras. Then comes the interesting one, Shulba Sutra. This Shulba Sutra is the science of creating those altars that you see. So on the left, you see one of the Vedika altars. These are made using bricks or stones, mostly bricks. These are 5 layers of bricks, which are laid in a very specific way, with a specific angle, size, 3-dimensional construction. And to create that, it requires them to measure the angles, lengths, etc. in a 3-dimensional plane. So, Sulbha Sutra is all that geometry, spatial geometry and trigonometry, which helped the rishis in creating the altars like that. The one you see is called Shyena. Shyena means falcon or perhaps eagle, maybe falcon. So that shape of a bird, you see, commonly, not nowadays, but in the old days when such grand scale yajnas used to be performed, then it's a huge, massive bird. Perhaps a human will be here. One point in this is human, but it will be created as a huge falcon. I have a picture actually that they discovered of an ancient falcon like this. Let me show you that. So it's a very old, therefore broken falcon. Can you imagine a falcon here? This must have been a multi-storied altar, very large. This they found a few years back, buried in Uttar Pradesh, near Yamuna and Tons, where those rivers meet. So anyway, it required science of very specific, precise geometry. If I start talking about it, it will take me more than an hour. So I will not talk much about that. But you should know that most of what you are taught as Pythagoras discovery or some other Greek person's discovery, those Greeks themselves are indebted to Indians for having made those discoveries first. So lot of that mathematical, especially trigonometry and geometry, comes from those Sulbha Sutras. Okay. Last is Dharma Sutra, again another amazing thing where Indians were far ahead of the rest. Dharma Sutras are again code of conduct of ethics and morals, which the society should abide by. So in American Constitution, for example, or generally the constitutions of the West, or thinking of how the society should be, you hear so much about this right and that right, human rights, animal rights, women rights, Black Lives Matter, all of that, yes? It's all about rights. What does society owe to me? It's all about that. Dharma Sutra or the Vedic society is exact 180 degrees opposite. The Vedic society wants us to think not what society owes to us, but what we owe to the society. What is it that I should be doing? What is my duty? What do I ought to do for my country, for my society, for my neighbor, for my family, for my father, for my child, for my husband or wife, for my brother, for my teacher, for my guest? What is it that I should be doing? Not what they should be doing for me. That's the main, very basic difference between the constitutions and the societies of West and that of India. We always have been told by our sages and rishis to keep an eye on what is it that you have to do. If you do what you have to do, and if everybody does what they have to do, then you will never have to even worry about rights, because you will get more rights than if you asked for the rights. Okay, so this, only if you can understand this basic difference, that our dharma shastras talk about dharma. Dharma is what is the righteous way, what is the virtuous thing to do, what is the right thing to do. That is dharma in a very brief, very vague, rough way. But that's how much you can talk about dharma in English language. It's very hard to translate dharma. But never say that dharma is religion. Dharma is not a religion at all. Religion and dharma, we will talk some other day. Another thing which is very different between Vedic dharma and Western understanding of it is this whole thing about monotheism and polytheism. I'm sure those of you who are in middle school or high school have come across these terms, and you commonly say or hear others say that, hey, Hindus are polytheists, while Christians, Muslims, Jews, they are monotheists, etc. These terms, polytheist, monotheist, etc., perhaps should not apply to Vedic dharma at all. So, okay, so I didn't plan to go into that, but let's spend 5 minutes talking about it. So, monotheist means there is only one God. Theist, this term comes from Latin, theos. Theos means, which actually is a common word in Sanskrit also, deva. So deva, what we call deva, they call theos. So theist means somebody who believes in God is theist. Somebody who does not believe in the existence of God is called atheist. Now theist, they say, again, I'm not talking our thinking, I'm just explaining what West thinks, Christians think. Then somebody who believes that there is only one God is called monotheist. Okay. And then they say, from their point of view, they say that somebody then who believes that there are more than one God is called poly, because poly means more, polytheist. So that's their thought process about monotheist, polytheist. Now, quite honestly, even in their own history, okay, still I'm not talking about anything about Vedic or Hindu dharma, their own thought process. If you look at the history of, let's say, Old Testament or Torah of the Jews, they clearly say that we are worshippers of one God. They don't deny the existence of so-called other gods. They simply say that because my God is a jealous God who gets angry if I look at somebody else, just like a jealous wife. If you know what I'm talking about. A wife wants the husband only to have one wife, not look at another woman, or so that kind of psychology is what the god that we worship, they say, also has. He is very jealous. If I look at some other god, he gets angry because he doesn't want us to look at some other god. That behavior existed in the beginning. They did not deny the existence of other gods, simply that our god tells us to worship me only, nobody else. That is called monolaterous, actually. Monolaterous means there are other gods, but I worship my god only. That behavior is what they had. But then if you do that, naturally you will very soon start believing that other gods must be something wrong. Because my god tells me to not look at other gods, others must be something wrong. So when you have done that, othering, and singled out your god as the worship worthy, then slowly you will also abusing the other gods. You will say other gods are demons, other gods are devils, Satan. So that kind of relationship will happen. So,
do you know that Stella was a Newfoundland?
Guys, can you mute yourself? I've told multiple times. Mute yourself. So, in the Vedic world, however, that kind of framework doesn't exist. In minds of rishis, everything is the same divinity. Everything. There is nothing outside or nothing beyond that, what you call God, Rishi would say. He would laugh at this whole discussion about monotheism, polytheism, nature worship. No, we are none of those. We are neither monotheist nor polytheist, neither atheist. We are beyond all this whole discussion itself. Why? Because Vedic Rishi would say that not for a moment are you outside of the existence of that whole, whatever word you give, God, divinity. Only when you have to go deeper and experience that divinity, you, for your own psychological, spiritual experiences, really realize that, then there are certain appearances, again, experiences, which are pretty consistent, which is what we call deity. These deities or devata in Hindi, Sanskrit Bhasha, devata is that experience. Devata is that bright, that delightful, that consistent and true experience of that divinity. That is devata. So Rishi would say, you guys are crazy talking about this monotheism, polytheism. We are beyond that. I'm sorry, I got digressed. I didn't want to get into that, but that's the Kalpa. Dharma Sutra is also part of Kalpa. And then, how are we doing on time? Okay, we are okay. Upaveda is the other supplemental, augmental literature of the Vedas. And there are four primary, there are actually four Upavedas, not primary, four Upavedas. Ayurveda, which is about the life sciences. Ayurveda is closely connected with Atharva Veda also. So Ayurveda, again, Indian medicine knowledge is perhaps unique, both in terms of its history and also in terms of its travel. So we have a text called Charaka Sanghita. Charaka Sanghita is written sometime in the 1st century BCE, okay, which is 2200 years or 2100 years before our own time. Written by Patanjali, this Charaka Sanghita is perhaps the most referred to journals of medicine all over the world. It went from India to Iran. They translated it into Persian language. From there it went to Europe in Latin language. They have the name also of that Latin book, which is perhaps 4th century or 5th century AD. That Latin book is also called Saracus. So Charaka is broken as Saracus. Saracus Indiacus, I think that's the name of that medical treatise in Latin. The Arabs continued to refer to Charaka Sanghita. And by the way, Charaka Sanghita is not the oldest medical book. Sushruta is the older medical compendium of knowledge that we have, where Sushruta talks about surgery. I earlier told you that in the Mohenjo-daro they found couple of teeth which have a precise drilled hole for doing some dentistry operation. That is about 4,500 years before our time. Sushruta actually describes several surgeries, including plastic surgery. So when Prime Minister Modi some time back said that Vedas talk about plastic surgery, people laughed. But no, it's a truth that Vedic literature, especially Ayurvedic literature, does talk about plastic surgery. Absolutely. They used to do brain surgeries. Can you imagine that? They used to do transplantation of organs. That is all described and mentioned, and it's not some fantasy. There used to be even vaccination. So British records, for example, colonial period British records, mention that there used to be these doctors. Of course, doctor, when you say this word doctor, you might be imagining a picture with somebody who is wearing a white coat and has a stethoscope on the neck, things like those. But imagine a Brahmana going from house to house in the village and performing vaccination. That is all recorded by the British colonials, that these people used to perform vaccination. And when I say vaccination, it's actual vaccination. They used to take the blood from the person who has been cured of a certain disease. They used to culture it. They used to create then certain injections which used to be injected into the healthy population of the village. All of that, as I said, is well documented. So it used to happen in India up to even 1700s. Okay. Dhanurveda, the art of war, is part of another Upaveda. And we have a very detailed description, very scientific description of how to do the war. It talks about different types of arms, talks about different technologies to use in war. It also talks about the ethics of the war. And by the way, again, another topic which I don't want to broach, which is the caste system. Maybe it's a topic in itself. I think each one of us needs to carefully study the so-called caste system, etc. But quick comment about Dhanurveda. Dhanurveda actually says that every varna, every jati in the society should take up arms, and it has far more detailed description. It also talks about ethics. So it, for example, tells the warriors never to attack a woman unless the warrior herself is a woman, of course. Never attack a woman. Don't attack a child ever. Don't attack your enemy when he is sleeping or intoxicated or naked. So also never attack your enemy when he is begging or running away. You can arrest him, but not, you can make him a prisoner of war, but you cannot then, once he surrenders or once he tries to escape, war is over. You have won, he has lost. Never kill somebody who has lost. Okay, so that kind of ethics is written in Dhanurveda. Okay, just so that you know. And we see this practiced actually in down to Chhatrapati Shivaji's time. We see this kind of ethics even after Ranjit Singh, the king of Punjab, his time. We see all these kind of ethics very well practiced. Problem is the enemy never practiced the ethics. So that's a topic again for some other day, whether the ethics can be unilaterally applied. If your enemy is hell-bent to break all the rules and destroy you, should you still be bound by the rules, or is it okay, does your dharma allow you to bend your rules for this context? So that's something you should think about. But definitely Dhanurveda gives very specific not only the science and technology and methods of how to do the war, but it also gives you the ethics of how to do the war. Then Gandharva Veda is associated with Sama Veda. Gandharva is those mystical beings, not mythical, mystical beings who are involved in dancing, music, drama, etc. Devatas in their world, these Gandharvas and these Nartakis, they are all yakshas, they are always associated with music and dance and drama. So we have a complete science of music which talks about in detail intonations, different raga raginis, the principles and science behind not only singing but also playing instruments. So all of that knowledge is perhaps first that appeared in India. Okay. And lastly, the Sthapatya. Sthapatya is the architecture. So with the Sulbha Sutra, which talks about trigonometry, geometry of creating the altars, Vedic people had such a great knowledge about the architecture of building homes, building public buildings, creating temples, creating other constructions of public utility, that there is a separate whole body of literature called Sthapatya Veda. Okay. Now, so you have seen, of course, the cities in Harappa, etc., which were unparalleled by any other civilization. Even the Egypt did not have cities like that. They had pyramids, but where are the cities? No. Here, the Sthapatya Veda, that is our sense of architecture, was all for public good. It was for making everybody happy, making humans happy, animals happy, gods happy. So that's the Sthapatya Veda. I will stop here before we proceed. Any questions? You can unmute yourself, ask the question, mute again. Okay, so we'll proceed.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Many of the teachers in our school, when they were teaching Hinduism, they said that Hinduism is a monotheistic religion because of Brahma.
Yes, they might, some say polytheistic, some say monotheistic, but what I'm trying to say is that whole framework doesn't apply to Hindus. We believe that there is nothing outside of Brahma at all. Brahma is the only thing. You can say that I'm monotheist only if there is something other than God, right? You see what I'm saying? If you say that I have, let's say I'm a woman and I'm saying I have only one husband, which means there is a possibility of having more than one husband. If there is no possibility of having more than one husband, why would I even say that I have one husband? Of course, if I'm married, I have one husband, that will be understood. But only in a society where this concept is lurking in the background, a woman would say, I have one husband. You see what I'm saying? Same thing is in context of monotheist, polytheist, etc.
Why are we taking this in a weird way?
What's that?
Never mind. Continue. Never mind.
So we rishis have told us that there is nothing other than the existence of God. The whole existence is God. Everything that you can see or not see, feel or not feel is God. Nothing else exists. If nothing else exists, then how can you talk about monotheist, polytheist? Okay, that's the whole I want to say. This conversation is inapplicable, but we will definitely talk about that some other time. It is weird, I agree. Maybe the explanation also is weird, but this whole concept is like if you want to measure, for example, length of an object, and you are given the weighing machine, can you measure the length of an object with a weighing machine? You cannot. It is the same way. You cannot use this framework of monotheist, polytheist, atheist to understand the dharma. Dharma is different from religion. Okay? You can apply this measurement on religion, but not on Vedic dharma or dharma. Any other question? Okay. So we looked at Veda, Vedanta, Veda. Can you please mute yourself again? Next two things we should understand are Purana and Itihasa, because those are very closely connected with the study of history. So let's look at Itihasa first. Itihasa literally means history. Let me go to Itihasa. Itihasa literally means history, and there are two such texts available to us as part of Vedic corpus of literature, which are called Itihasa. Does anybody want to guess what are those two Itihasa that we have?
Ramayana and Mahabharata.
Well done, absolutely.
Ramayana and Mahabharata.
That is correct.
Mahabharata.
Yep, that is absolutely correct. So, Itihasa, this literally means Iti, Ha, Asa. Those three words together, they become Itihasa, which means that is how it happened. That's what the meaning of Itihasa is. And we have Ramayana, which is the older Itihas, and the Mahabharata, which is the later Itihas after Ramayana. And in the Ramayana, we see that there is kind of the description of society that you see is pretty archaic. If you study Ramayana in the original, the description of the journey of Rama, for example, if you follow his path, you will cross kind of the length of India from Ayodhya, where his father's kingdom was. He goes to the central India, where with Lakshmana and Sita he lives at today place called Ramatek. From there he goes to Panchavati, etc. And then that whole journey along the Ramayana is also a historical and geographical path, which you can clearly see also has elements which might seem magical, such as tribal societies which are on the fringe of civilization. Yes, you'll come across that kind of society. You also come across pre-tribal society, even cave dwellers. Somebody is trying to say something.
Yeah. Where is Kishkinda located?
Kishkinda is here where you see this Hampi, etc. This area is called Kishkinda. But I will again pause for questions. Until then, hold your comments and questions. Okay, don't interrupt. So this entire journey, I'm not going to tell you the whole narration of Rama's journey. What the main point is, in the epic of Ramayana, you see the practical implementation of that Vedic dharma. Everything that you heard before as the Vedic lifestyle, Vedic practices, Vedic beliefs, ethics, morals. In Rama's journey, Rama's life, you see the practical implementation of that entire Vedic life. If historical perspective, you also see similar characters also appearing. So Vasishtha, Vishwamitra, for example, who are Rigvedic sages, they are part of Rama's story. And again, I don't know whether I can go into those details in interest of time, but Rigveda is the Rigveda that is available to us. Like I said, there were other branches of Rigveda which are lost also. So Rigveda which is available to us is belonging to one clan of people called Bharatas. And Bharatas are part of a bigger clan called Pauravas or Purus. So in the Rig Veda, they talk about Panchajan or Panchajanya, or 5 people, Panchajan. So 5 tribes. They say that the Manu, or the current Manu, the human who started this civilization after huge hiatus in the previous cycle, right? You know, last time I explained how in Indian thought process, history is not a straight line, it's not a circle, it's actually spiral, it is helical, where one cycle is of sort completes, then another cycle starts, but in each cycle there will be somewhat different types of phenomenon, different characters. And in each cycle, however, there will be some pattern also. And these cycles, each cycle is called a kalpa. And each kalpa is divided into 4 yugas. First is called Satya Yuga, then is called Treta Yuga, then Dwapara Yuga, and then Kali Yuga. So these 4 yugas are part of each kalpa, and then each kalpa together multiple kalpas, and it goes on that way. So it's a spiral model of history. This
What Kruta
concept.
Yuga?
Sorry, is there a comment?
About Kruta Yuga.
Yeah, Krita Yuga is another name of Satya Yuga. Krita means creation. Okay, so Satya Yuga is the creation Yuga, which starts after the entire cycle is completed and new cycle starts. Between that period, there is kind of no civilization, and then again Krita Yuga happens. And Krita Yuga happens with Manu. So in each cycle, there is a new Manu which starts that whole cycle. That person is called Manu. In the current cycle of which we are part, we are in Kali Yuga. This cycle was started, and that Manu is called Vaivaswata Manu. That Manu had multiple sons. One branch is called Ikshwaku branch. Another branch, so these Ikshwakus are Suryavanshis, okay, solar lineage. And then another set of children of this Manu, they are called Chandravanshis. So Suryavanshis are part of eastern India, northeastern India, which is where Ayodhya, etc. is. Rama, Buddha, these people belong to that set of children of Manu. And then another set of children, all the Arjuna, Krishna, all these people that you hear in Mahabharata, most of them, they belong to these Chandravanshis. These Chandravanshis also had 5 clans. One of those clans were Pauravas. Within Pauravas, one clan is called Bharata, children of Bharata. They are the ones who truly own this Rig Veda that is available to us. And I think I confused you quite a lot. What I want to tell you is that Rama's journey is, from historical perspective, an effort by the Vedic society, beyond everything else, to create a major integration of sorts. Integration on one end, and civilizational expansion on the other end. Conflict with the civilized and anti-civilizational people. So again, as you know, Ravana and these Rakshasas, they are also ethnically related with these rishis only. Ravana himself is son of a rishi. So it's not an ethnic conflict, it is a conflict of values. So please understand that. It is a conflict of values, conflict of what is civilization and anti-civilization, and that effort is Rama's journey. So Ramayana itself is our national epic. Swami Vivekananda has said an interesting thing. He says that there may come a time when nobody in the world may know Sanskrit Bhasha. There may come a time when all the Hindus may have forgotten recitation of Vedas. Nobody might even have access to the text of Veda. Still, Vaidika Dharma will live through the story of Ramayana, which will never die, Swami Vivekananda said, very nicely said. He said that the story of Ramayana is so much inside our lore, inside our life, inside every Hindu's family, that Ramayana story will remain. And through the Ramayana, the Vaidika Dharma will remain. And Ramayana story is so powerful. This history, not story, this Ramayana history is so powerful that it traveled all over the world. So if you study the variations of Ramayana as followed in Japan, in Cambodia, Indonesia, within Indonesia also they have multiple, there's a Javanese and the Balinese Ramayana. Thailand, Champa and Cambodia, they have very popular Rama Leela kind of a concept. They call it Ramakien in Thailand. In Indonesia, Ramayana is visible everywhere, including on the currency notes. So that's how popular Ramayana is. Within India, of course, Valmiki Ramayana is one of the most celebrated text within the Vedic corpus. Beyond the text, Ramayana is a living story. Every child, every woman, every old person recites Ramayana in multiple languages. So right from Tamil, there is Kamban Ramayana in Tamil, to Bengal, where Krittivasa Ramayana is popular, to Kannada, Telugu, Hindi, every language, Marathi, Nepali, has their own translation, adaptation, retelling of Valmiki's original great epic. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
Well, how did you get all the way from India to Malaysia and all these other countries?
Okay, yeah, good question. So, unlike the West, where they only have conquered civilizations, other countries, other people, made war, extracted the resources of other people and utilized it for their own benefit. Vedic society, Hindu society, historically has never done that. We believe in sharing. We believe in offering what we know, what we have, and that has created so much of waves of civilization spreading out of India. So as I started this presentation, the quotation of Mark Twain, that India is the mother of tradition, mother of culture, mother of language, etc. That is literally true only because of this, that India has, first of all, had very open box knowledge, which is offered to anyone who wants to benefit from it. In the Middle Ages, in the time between 9th century and 13th century, and we will talk more in detail about those perhaps 2 classes later. But between the 9th century and 13th century, there was a lot of exchange with the East Asia. So all this area that we know as Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, we had a lot of naval exchange with them and civilizational give and take. And these created local empires. So for example, there was an empire called Sri Vijaya Empire, based in Indonesia, very powerful kingdom, which was totally Hindu. So by Hindu, never confuse that only Indians are Hindus, never confuse that. Hindus are not only Indians, but huge population outside India as well. And the travel, of course, happened not only of Ramayana, but so many other things. If you go to Bali, you will find some of the terms used which are found only in Tamil and Sanskrit Bhasha. In Balinese language, they have so much of linguistic impact. In Philippines also, several terms such as karma, such as dharma, etc., very commonly used in Tagalog language. In the behavior also, you will never feel that these people have a very different value system. All of that civilizational unity existed beyond India as well. India has always shared this knowledge, this whole great revelation with the whole world freely. Ramayana, by the way, is found even in Persian and Arabic, and not today, but for more than 1,300, 400 years. Any other comment?
Is the class done? Because I have to go soon.
I think it's almost done, yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay.
And then after Ramayana, Mahabharata, another great epic of the next epoch, where I mentioned Ikshvaku, those Ikshvakus were the main characters of Ramayana. Now the Ailas, or the another branch of Manu, they are the main characters of Mahabharata. And Mahabharata is western, northwestern, whereas Ramayana is northeastern, part of the Vedic lore. So again, I think you all are very familiar with Mahabharata. It is commonly said that what is in Mahabharata can be found elsewhere, but Mahabharata is so broad that what is not in Mahabharata is impossible to find. So Mahabharata is the biggest book of the time. It has more than 1 lakh, which is 100,000, more than 100,000 verses. Valmiki's Ramayana has about 24,000, 25,000 verses. Okay. Mahabharata has more than 100,000 verses. It is the great book which has so many other books in it, such as Bhagavad Gita, that every Hindu respects, reads, follows. Bhagavad Gita is a small part of Mahabharata itself. Mahabharata has so many other very popular and important literature within it. So for example, Vishnu Sahasranam, or the so many other stutis are part of Mahabharata. It comes from Mahabharata. Okay. Similarly, Vidura Gita, Ashtavakra Mahagita, all of those are part of Mahabharata itself. So during the Mahabharata, what you can clearly see is that this idea of India had become truly pan-India. In the Rig Veda, we saw last time that the places that are talked about are centered around Indus and Saraswati, Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh area. In Ramayana, we saw that got expanded from North India, Ayodhya, etc., all the way to Sri Lanka, Rameshwaram, Kishkindha in Karnataka, in Andhra, in Maharashtra, etc. In Mahabharata, we can truly see that the entire India was integrated civilizationally and politically as one unit. So this often we hear that until the British came to India, India didn't exist. This whole unity is given to India, identity is given to India by the British. This is a fake narrative, because very clearly we see that in Mahabharata, right from northeast in Arunachala, we hear the story where Rukmini, Krishna's wife, belongs to northeastern part of India. Rukmi, her brother, was a prince of Arunachal Pradesh, then or somewhere in northeast. Then we hear a king from southern Karnataka, Udupi, was part of this whole war, but he reached late. By the time he reached, war had just started. So he took care of all the cooking arrangements for the Pandavas. That is the story. All the South Indian great kingdoms, of which we will talk about in subsequent classes, Cholas, Pandyas, they all trace their lineage to the Pandavas. So Pandyas, they believe that they say that they were part of the Mahabharata war as well. Cholas, in their own history, trace their lineage also to the same people. This whole Mahabharata, from that perspective, if you read, you will see national integration, founding of a nation in a way. Okay, and when did Mahabharata happen? So again, that's a long topic, but short answer of that will be around 3000 to somewhere between 3000 to 2000 BCE. Again, there are different opinions. Archaeologists are still trying to find. There are some work which has happened in last 20 years to archaeologically correlate the chronology of Mahabharata, but that's an entirely different topic. I think last topic for today is there are Puranas. Puranas are older histories. So while we have Ramayana and Mahabharata as the Itihasa, classical history, Purana are far more long-range history, which talk about creation of the universe, which talk about all these yugas that we mentioned, Manus and the dynasties of Manu's children, dynasties of the rishis, all of that. So there are 18 such Puranas. Puranas are fairly old. In fact, Rigveda itself, or Vedic literature itself, mentions Purana, this word. But perhaps the Purana they are talking about are lost to us. These Puranas that we have access to are perhaps not that old, but still they are not new. Some of these are definitely going back to pre-BCE time. Some of them were written soon afterwards. So some of these Puranas may even be altered subsequently, and maybe around 1000 Common Era, etc. They were altered. So there are 18 Puranas, and I think one of the things that we should do is to remember their names. And I'm not going to do that now because we don't have time anymore. But it will be a work for you. There's a shloka which, if we remember, then with that help of that shloka, we can recite the names of all the 18 important Puranas. Okay. And yes, so one of the Purana, Vishnu Purana, says that Bharat is, definition of Bharat is south of Himalaya, north of the seas. Everything in between is India. So we see that whole concept of founding of India is at least that old, which Vishnu Purana is perhaps 200 or 300 of the Common Era. Another thing we see in the popular Vedic literature is the tirthas, that they are located all over the India. So there is a concept of therefore spiritual nation, cultural nation. So Char Dham, for example, as you have seen the regions of India, located in 4 corners of our geography. Same way the 12 Jyotirlingas, or important Shiva temples, are also located north, east, west, south, almost like marking a periphery to India. And same goes for the Shakti Pithas. So we have 52 Shakti Pithas, some say 56, some say 51. But Shakti Pitha are Devi's temples, important temples of the Devi. Those also, almost if you look at the spots where those temples are located, it marks entire map of India. Some more concentration in east, but you can still clearly see a map of India made out of Shakti Pithas. Next time we will start with this topic about 16 Mahajanapadas, and we would have reached, we'll talk about Buddha and invasion of Alexander and Maurya Empire, all of that. So that will be for next time. In any comments, questions, thoughts?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How come we don't read any of this in our textbooks? And all we read about is about Great Britain and all the great Greeks.
Yeah, which is why we are doing this class, right? Because in our class we don't read about those things, so we need to do extra effort to read them.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why are many nations saying that the god Ram wasn't born in India?
I could not hear. Can you repeat?
That's a loud mic.
Repeat the question.
Who's asking why some nations think that Rama is not born in India? Some people say that he's born in Nepal. Sometimes.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So, see, Greeks had their great epic. I'm sure you know their names.
Yes.
Yeah, Iliad and Odyssey. Iliad and Odyssey were very great. I have a lot of respect for those epics. West has lost them. Outside of those epics, there was another one, the Gilgamesh, it is known as. It was the Mesopotamia's great epic, lost. Similarly, Chinese had some epics of their own, lost again. They don't have any such epic. It is only us, the Indic people, Hindu people, Vedic people, who can really be proud of having these national civilizational epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata. And people who are jealous to Indians, and there is a lot of jealousy that's beyond scope of the conversation, but the West has always been jealous. Maybe we can talk about history of their jealousy sometime, but West has been jealous of India for a very, very long time. Therefore, they first of all want to ignore you. They will not mention these things, that grammar was invented in India, that geometry and trigonometry were invented in India, that poetry and drama was invented in India. Never they will say those things. They want to ignore you, number one. And number two, where they cannot ignore you, of course they cannot ignore Ramayana, which is sung all over not only India, but an entire Asia up to Japan. When they cannot ignore artifact like Ramayana, then they will obfuscate it. They will try to minimize it. They will try to cover it in one sentence, two sentences in your textbook, try to contain its reach and its impact. Yes. And when they cannot do that also, then they will do something more cruel, which will be to distort it. So they will then say that, hey, Rama was an Afghan prince. You know that some Western scholars say that this whole story of Ramayana, Ayodhya and Saryu, which is mentioned in Ramayana, are not this India's Ayodhya and Saryu. There is a small village in Afghanistan, and then Lanka is somewhere in Balochistan. It's a small tribal story. So they say those things simply out of the inferiority complex. They cannot fathom that there was a civilization which still continues, which is so rich, which is so ethical, which is so nice. Therefore, they will distort it. Same thing about this whole monotheistic, polytheistic thing. Exactly same thing about this whole caste system. So that's their compulsion. They simply are jealous. They feel inferiority, and therefore they are forced to do such things. Any other comments?
I have to go right now, so is it okay if I just watch the rest of it on the video?
Yeah, anybody who has to go can drop anytime. Yeah. Any other question? If not, I think we can conclude.
I have to go.
Like I said, anybody who has to go can drop. So let us conclude for today. Please, let's do the Shanti mantra. Please say after me.
Why don't they say India built an empire, but they say Britain and the Greeks built an empire and all those other things, but they don't say anything about India?
Pratyusha, I could not hear your question.
Why don't they say India built an empire? Because they say Great Britain and the Greeks built an empire and all kinds of other things. But they always exclude India.
Yeah. We also built a lot of great empires. We will talk about those empires soon, Pratyusha. Okay, so please say after me. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramaya Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukha Bhag Bhavet. Okay, namaste everyone. Talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste. Namaste.
Bye.
Thanks.
You.
Thanks and bye.
Bye, Sarthak.
Bye.